Hello everyone. In this presentation I'm going to be providing some historical context on the 18th to the 19th century, or the Romantic period. Specifically, I will be focusing on the poets Anne Finch and John Keats. So, let's get started. First, for the historical context, I'd like to start to say that the 18th century is a century of revolutions. During this time period, the Industrial Revolution, which was a movement away from the agricultural-based society to an industrial one, sparked rapid changes in people's lives. Now, the Industrial Revolution is something that we are still experiencing to this day as we continue to experience rapid advances in technology. The most prominent political and governmental revolutions of the time period are the American and French revolutions. The American Revolution occurred in 1776, while the French Revolution occurred just a few years later in 1789. In Thomas Paine's Rights of Man, which was published around 1791 to 1792, Paine advocated for a democratic republic that was to be achieved if lesser pressures failed by popular revolution. It was this kind of thinking that justified the American and French revolutions, not to mention those that followed in their wake. On another political front, people were experiencing more political focus on women's rights. And, of course, one of the major works of this time period is Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication for the Rights of Women, which was published in 1792. Wollstonecraft radically advocated for the rights of women, having perceived that women constitute an oppressed class that was cut across the standard hierarchy of social classes. She shows that women, because they are denied their rights as human beings, have been forced to seek their ends by means of coquetry and cunning, the weapons of the weak, and have demonstrated that it is contrary to reason to expect virtue from those who are not free. And now for our first poet, Anne Finch. Anne Finch was born and later married into the noble class. She and her husband fell in and out of favor with the royal court because of shifting political realities during their lifetimes. She started writing during 1680, and I must add that during this time women were not allowed an education, at least not the same formal education that men could receive. If a woman was educated, she was educated by private tutors or through her family, that is to say that her parents were the ones who educated her. And so women's education was inconsistent throughout society. Women and their families had to have access to books and the skills to be able to apply their knowledge to things like writing and the arts. And so, in many ways, Finch seems to have been one of the lucky few women who did receive an education, even if it was an informal one. An introduction to an early manuscript of her poetry expressed resentment of male attitudes to a woman writer. However, she was respected by contemporary male writers, and later inspired romantic writers like William Wordsworth, who praised the natural description in her Nocturnal Reverie. When reading Anne Finch's poetry, I suggest looking for the following themes. First, Anne Finch uses poetry to focus on creative inspiration or the imagination. As far as subjects in the poems that we're going to read, Finch illustrates what it's like for women writers working in an art dominated by male voices and critics. The nightingale, an ancient Greek symbol of artistic inspiration through pain, is one of her vehicles for illustrating the pressures that women writers face. Furthermore, Finch turns to nature and the night as particularly feminine sources of inspiration. Late in the 18th century, we started to see a new movement in poetic and artistic writing that scholars call the Romantic period, and it lasts between 1785 to 1832. Romantic poets largely responded to social and economic changes by looking to and echoing the past. Imagining the songs a bard might have sung in long ago times made it easier to conceive an alternative to the mundane language of modernity. They looked at the literary past for inspiration and believed that passionate impulses should govern poetic creation. The immediate act of composition must be spontaneous, impulsive, artless, and free from rules. This meant that a lot of Romantic poetry seems to convey the immediacy of emotion and the passions. Indeed, so many of the poets from the Romantic period seem to have been written from extreme passions, such as extreme love and extreme hate. Additionally, the poems themselves were meant to appear spontaneous. However, we should not confuse that with artlessness. These poems were constructed with care and precision. Individualism and alienation were also sources of inspiration during the Romantic period. The epoch of free enterprise, imperial expansion, and boundless revolutionary hope was also an epoch of individualism in which philosophers and poets alike put an extraordinarily high estimate on human potentialities. The period redefined heroism and made a ceaseless striving for the unattainable its crucial element. Unfortunately, due to the time constraints of this course, we only have time to focus on one Romantic poet, and that's John Keats. John Keats lived from 1795 to 1821. His father was a head stableman and inherited a business from his wife's father. He had an affectionate yet negligent mother, and it's potentially this relationship that inspired his representation of women in his poetry. Although he was inspired by poetry early in life, he was pressured into taking up medical studies by his guardian. Nevertheless, in 1815 he quit his studies for poetry. According to the introduction I provided, under the richly sensuous surface we find Keats's characteristic presentation of all experience as a tangle of inseparable but irreconcilable opposites. He finds melancholy in delight and pleasure in pain. To clarify the themes we find in Keats's poetry, I'd like to explain what I mean when I say melancholy in delight and pleasure in pain. Although these expressions seem like contradictory opposites, they are universal experiences. Have you ever had a scab that even though picking at it was painful, there was an experience of pleasure buried within the pain? Or have you ever heard the song lyric, addicted to a certain kind of sadness? If you've answered yes, then you've experienced exactly what Keats's poetry is aiming to represent. His poetry delves into those seemingly contradictory human emotions where we find pleasure in pain and sadness. Another more salacious way of looking at this can be seen within the realm of BDSM or bondage sadomasochism. Like Finch, Keats also looks into the past and to nature to best illustrate his poetic themes. Thank you for watching, and please let me know if you have any questions.